Every 30 days, this world ships 900,000 metric tons of food to the front lines of the Imperium. Most of the soldiers who eat it will be dead within a year. The planet knows this. The planet keeps farming anyway. You have heard about the void battles, the orbital land strikes, the titans walking through burning cities like gods made of steel in scripture. But nobody ever asks what feeds that war. Nobody ever thinks about a world with no name worth remembering, where the harvest machines grind forward in the gray pre-dawn, and where the only thing growing in the soil is the knowledge that the men eating this grain are already, statistically, dead. This is Veridian Secundus, and this is the quiet horror the Imperium never talks about. The agri-priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus renamed it Cultivation Node Seven-Theta-Eleven approximately 400 years ago, when the last of its indigenous forests were processed into raw mulch and the last of its river fauna were reclassified as biological inefficiency and removed. The administratum subsector tithes still call it Veridian Secundus, but the people who work its soil, the ones who have breathed its particulate air for long enough to stop noticing, call it something else entirely. They call it the plate, as in the meal set before a condemned man, generous, steaming, utterly meaningless in the face of what is coming for him. The first thing that reaches you when a droplighter descends through its amber-gray atmosphere is not the view. It is the smell. And it is not the smell of soil or harvest or any of the warm living things those words suggest. It is the smell of scale, of biology pressed beyond the point where it retains any individual character. The grain, a Mechanicus-engineered protein strain modified to resist all known fungal pathogens, grow in depleted soil and yield 4 times any natural equivalent produces in such quantities, a scent that sits at the back of the throat and stays there, warm, dense, slightly fermented at the edges where older growth touches the new planting cycle that never fully pauses. After 3 days on the plate, you cannot remember what air smelled like before it. After 3 years, you stop trying. Then comes the sound. The cultivator-class agri-platforms, each one the size of a city block, moving on tracks that have ground permanent channels into the subsoil over decades of repetition, produce a noise that does not shock the way artillery does. It does not startle. It is so constant, so woven into every waking moment, that it stops registering as external and begins registering as internal. The grinding of harvester teeth, the hydraulic compression of the threshing bays, the low percussion of sorting conveyors that never stop. Workers who have spent more than 5 years on Veridian Secundus report that when the machinery is taken offline for maintenance, the silence feels like a symptom of something dying. So they pray for the machines to restart. They stand in the sudden quiet and they pray, and that act of prayer tells you everything you need to know about what this world has done to the men and women who serve it. The quota is the center of everything. The planetary tithe, formalized in the Monetorum's agricultural assessment ledger as Veridian Secundus's primary output obligation, is not a number that changes. It is a number that only increases. Every decade when the assessment fleet arrives in system and the senior agri-overseer submits the yield data to Monitorum representatives in their sealed void suits, the conversation follows the same arc. Yield presented, yield noted, new obligation announced. And the new obligation is always larger than the current yield. Somewhere in the Monetorum's actuarial understanding of the Imperium's resource requirements, a mathematical relationship exists between the rate of military consumption and the rate of agricultural production. The relationship is not balanced. It has never been balanced. The Imperium consumes faster than it can grow. This is not a crisis. It is a structural feature. You cannot feed infinite war with finite soil. But you can try. You can always try harder. The agri-tech assessment data exists in official records, logged and filed and stamped with Mechanicus seals that will outlast the civilization that produced them. The data shows, in the dry numerical language of Auspex surveys and soil composition readings, that the organic matter index on Veridian Secundus has declined by 63% over the last 2 centuries. The depth of viable topsoil has decreased by an average of 4 centimeters per decade. The fallow periods, Those seasons when the land was once allowed to rest have been compressed from 6 months to 3 to 6 weeks, and now are measured in days. The chemical augmentation required to maintain yield degrades the soil further, requiring more augmentation, and the curve of this process continues in one direction only. The Mechanicus agri-priests know this. They have logged it in triplicate. The logs exist, and the quota increases anyway because the war requires it, and the war is larger than the math. The workers are called cultivation serfs in the administrative tithes. The Adeptus Mechanicus prefers the designation biological processing units when their labor is logged against planetary output assessments. The workers themselves use no collective noun at all, because collectives suggest community, and community suggests the kind of latera, low social bonding that the agri-overseers have systematically discouraged as a productivity inefficiency across generations. They live in habspires, towers of poured ferrocrete rising from the flat cropscape at intervals of 40 kilometers, each housing between 800 and 1,200 individuals in stacked dormitory cells, barely long enough to lie down in. The spires have no windows facing the crop fields. The agri-overseers discovered, early in the world's conversion to full cultivation mode, that workers given visual access to the fields during non-working hours developed what the overseer reports described as productive output interference. In plain Gothic, that meant they stood at the windows and stared, and the staring hollowed them out in ways that eventually showed in their shift performance and their reproduction rates. So the windows face inward. You live on the plate, but you look at walls. The outside world, the world you feed, the fields you harvest, is something that happens to you rather than something you inhabit. Ration distribution occurs twice per standard day cycle. The rations are, by any objective nutritional standard, adequate. The agri-tech administra have calibrated them with precision, accounting for caloric expenditure across shift classifications, body mass, and the additional demands of workers in cultivar zones with declining birth rates. The food is always sufficient. It is also always the same. A compressed grain loaf, dense and slightly sweet from the fermentation stage of its processing, sized to fit a standard issue ration hand, a gray protein supplement of reliable consistency and no perceptible flavor, derived from the biological byproduct of the harvest process. The insects, the small fauna trapped in field margins, the microbial cultures grown in the spire's basement vats, water, treated, filtered, carrying the fash, int mineral signature of the deep aquifer, every meal, twice a day, for the entirety of a working life. Workers who have been on the plate for 20 years have eaten approximately 14,600 meals of identical composition. They do not complain. Complaining is a productivity inefficiency. But you notice, if you watch carefully, the way they hold the grain loaf before eating, that brief, unconscious pause, that fractional hesitation, that is not quite reverence, but is something adjacent to it, as though they are acknowledging something about the food that they cannot put into words. Perhaps they know, on some level below conscious thought, what the soil that grew it has given up, what it always gives up. There is a man in the data processing annex of Habspire 19 whose name is Edric Voss. He is 53 years old. On Veridian Secundus, that makes him ancient. The average productive lifespan of a cultivation serf, accounting for machinery injuries, respiratory conditions from decades of particulate inhalation, the degenerative joint diseases caused by vibration exposure, and a thing that takes people around the 40th year, the slow withdrawal from everything. The way they begin to look through walls rather than at them is 37 years of active service before reclassification to reduced function roles or medical retirement. Edric Voss is 53. He survived by moving from fieldwork to data entry, and from data entry to the specific and narrow task he now performs, which is the maintenance of the memorial ledger. The memorial ledger is not an official munitorum document. It was not mandated by the agri-overseers or the Mechanicus administrators. It began, approximately 80 years ago, when a quota-tracking serf named Ondine Prast began recording notations in the margins of official yield assessment data slates, not names. She did not know names, not in any specific way. but numbers. The ration mathematics were standard information available to anyone with access to procurement logistics data. 1 ton of processed grain loaf provided 4,000 soldier rations at standard Astra Militarum calorific parameters. 1 year's harvest from Veridian Secundus provided enough grain loaf for approximately 900 million soldier days of sustenance. She wrote this number in the margin of a data slate. Then she wrote, beside it, the casualty figures from the campaign reports arriving with the procurement fleet, reports technically irrelevant to agricultural planning, included as a morale management tool, evidence of the Imperium's glorious struggle. She cross-referenced the 2 numbers. She did the arithmetic, and she wrote, in the margin of the official data slate, in a hand the subsequent archivists described as steady and without tremor, a single sentence. We fed them. They are gone. We will feed more. Edric Voss maintains the ledger now. It has grown from a margin notation to 317 data slates, stored in a sealed case beneath his workstation, copied by hand each time a new assessment arrives with the procurement fleet. He does not analyze the data. He does not compute percentages or model decline curves. He simply records. He transfers the numbers from the official data slates to the memorial ledger with the same careful hand, in the same standard Gothic script, in the same methodical left-to-right progression across the page. Before each entry, he runs his thumb along the edge of the data slate. He has done it for 30 years without asking himself why. The data slate smell of treated polymer, slightly chemical, faintly warm from the cogitator systems they pass through. The memorial ledger does not change anything. The quota does not decrease because the ledger records the cost. The war does not pause because a man in a Ferrocrete tower has been quietly keeping score, but the ledger exists. The counting continues, and in the continued counting, in the refusal to let the numbers pass through the administrative machinery without leaving one human mark, there is something that the theological vocabulary of the imperial creed does not have a precise term for witness, perhaps the act of witnessing. On Veridian Secundus, it is the closest thing to resistance that the world produces. 3 years ago, a convoy of 52 bulk agri-transporters departed Veridian Secundus's orbital staging zone, carrying the largest single harvest yield in the world's recorded history. A yield, the senior agri-overseer described, at the tithe ceremony, as a testament to the Emperor's grace and the unbreakable will of the cultivation serf population. It entered the warp on schedule. Navigation servitors, Geller field integrity confirmed, course laid for the distribution waypoint in the Tertius Reach. Edric Voss logged the departure in his ledger with the same steady hand he uses for everything, noting the tonnage, noting the campaign designation of the intended recipients, the 47th Cadian Pattern Combined Arms Formation, engaged in the ongoing suppression of a Xenos incursion at the edge of the subsector. He noted the date. He noted the yield. The convoy never arrived. The Munitorum's notification of the loss reached Veridian Secundus 14 months later, buried in the standard procurement adjustment communication, reclassifying the yield as transit lost and adjusting the next cycle's quota accordingly, upward to compensate. 14 months, 52 vessels, 900,000 tons of food. The 47th Combined Arms had continued their campaign without the resupply, making do with reduced rations and emergency biological reclamation protocols, a term that appears in no official military dictionary, but that soldiers understand immediately. The campaign report in the same communication noted the formation had suffered a 67% casualty rate in the intervening period. Whether the two facts were connected, the Munitorum communication did not speculate. It adjusted the quota and closed the matter. Edric Voss added the entry to the ledger that evening. He wrote the convoy designation. He wrote transit lost. He wrote the casualty figure. Then he sat for a long time with his thumb on the edge of the data slate, and he did not run it along the edge in the usual way, and he did not immediately begin the next entry. The dormitory annex was quiet around him. Through the Ferrocrete walls, faintly, the harvest machines ground forward. After a while, he began to write again. Because there was nothing else to do, because the next cycle had already begun, because the soil was already growing what would compensate for the loss. And the compensation would not bring back the 52 vessels or the 67% of a formation that had continued the work of dying on empty stomachs, while Veridian Secundus's finest harvest drifted, somewhere in the space between rational geometry and the madness of the warp. The ledger recorded it. The machines continued. The quota was adjusted. This is what adequacy looks like, when you get close enough to see it clearly. There is a girl in the monitoring rotation of Habspire 19, whose name is Keitha Voss. She is Edric's granddaughter, a relationship of more administrative than emotional significance on the plate. Since dormitory assignments and shift rotations are managed by the agri-overseers rather than family preference, she is 12 years old, 5 weeks into the rotation, and she is already very good at not looking at the horizon. The monitoring rotati on is considered a developmental role for young workers, walking the intervals between cultivator platform tracks, operating handheld auspex units measuring soil moisture and composition, relaying readings to the central data cogitators. It introduces 11 and 12-year-olds to the scale of the plate, gradually enough that the acute psychological responses, the crying, the dissociative episodes, generally do not occur. After 30 days of the rotation, most children can walk a 6-kilometer interval without looking up from the auspex screen. The agri-overseers consider this a successful training outcome. It means the accommodation has occurred. It means the horizon no longer registers as something that should disturb them. When her auspex screen shows a green band reading, Keitha has approximately 40 seconds before the next measurement point. In those 40 seconds, she walks forward through the broken post-harvest earth. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes in the particular way of thoughts that arrive without permission, she thinks about the place the grain goes. She knows the grain feeds soldiers. She knows the war is eternal, and the quota is sacred, and the soil is the emperor's gift, made useful. She has the functional understanding that the Thai ceremonies press into children before they are old enough to question its shape. But she does not have an image of a soldier. No images of soldiers have been distributed to the cultivation serf population of Veridian Secundus for a very long time. What she has, instead of an image, is the number from the most recent tithe ceremony. 900 million soldier days of sustenance. And this number is so large that it has passed through the comprehension filter and come out the other side as something that is not a number anymore but a feeling. A sense of weight pressing down from somewhere far away. On the 38th day of her rotation, she looked at the horizon. She does not know why that day specifically. The auspex had given her a green band reading. She had 40 seconds, and instead of looking down at the screen, she looked up and out, across the broken field to where the sky met the crop line in a gray-brown seam that extended without variation in both directions as far as her eyes could resolve. The harvest luminators of the next platform grid were already lit in the early dusk, throwing hard white light across the stubble fields, and the light made the distance look falsely close, falsely comprehensible, a scale she could almost hold. She stood there for the full 40 seconds. The auspex chimed for the next measurement. She looked back down. She relayed the reading. She walked to the next point. She did not tell anyone. But that evening in the dormitory, lying in her bunk with the sound of the machines pressing through the walls, she thought about what she had seen, which was nothing extraordinary, nothing that would have registered as remarkable to anyone who had not been trained for 37 days to look away from it. Just the fields and the light and the distance. Just the honest size of the things she was part of. Just the horizon which had been there the entire time, waiting for her to look. She is Edric's granddaughter, though they do not share a meal rotation or a dormitory corridor. He does not know she looked at the horizon. She does not know he maintains the ledger. But somewhere in both of them, in the granddaughter who looked when she wasn't supposed to, and the granddaughter who counts what he isn't required to count, there is the same thing, not rebellion, not hope, exactly. Something quieter than both, the refusal to let the scale erase the particular, the insistence, small, private, practically invisible, on knowing what you are part of. There is a theology on Veridian Secundus that is distinct from the official ministorum liturgy delivered at tithe ceremonies. The agri-overseers have assessed it periodically and found it within acceptable doctrinal parameters, partly because of its content and partly because a population that has developed its own spiritual framework for processing unbearable conditions is a population that continues to function. And continued function is the only metric that ultimately matters. The folk theology of the plate holds, in the whispered liturgy of the plate holds, in the whispered liturgy cells, that the God Emperor knows exactly what Veridian Secundus is. He knows it the way a man in agony knows every part of his own body, with terrible, intimate precision. He does not send visions or blessings. He cannot. He is the sun that burns without warmth. He is the light that finds no comfort in giving light. He sustains because he must, and they sustain because they must, and the sustaining is a form of communion that requires no words and offers nothing in return. The war continues because something broke long ago in the architecture of what he built, and now everything runs on momentum and faith and the sheer grinding persistence of people who cannot stop. This is not heresy. The ministorum assessed it. This is just what the plate concluded, after enough time alone with the math. The agri-transport convoys leave Veridian Secundus's orbit every 30 standard days, between 40 and 60 bulk transporters, their hulls encrusted with centuries of incremental repair, the way long-service void craft accumulate identity through their damage, form in the orbital staging zone and begin the journey through the warp toward distribution waypoints that are, on average, 8 to 14 standard months distant. The servitor crews do not think about the astronomican slight that guides them, any more than the grain in the holds thinks about the soldiers who will eat it. The chain is too long for any link in it to comprehend the others. This is not a failure. It is the design. The Imperium of Man is too large for any of its parts to know the other parts as anything other than function. The soldier does not know the farmer. The farmer does not know the soldier. The munitorum knows both, as variables in an equation whose only solution is the continuation of the status quo. And the status quo is the war. At the forward supply depots near active combat zones, the grain loaf is transferred to smaller vessels, then to field depots, then to field depots. In the brutal logistics of a planetary assault or a grinding attrition war, by whatever means survive. Grav sled, human chain, individual carrying capacity, to the hands of soldiers who are cold and exhausted and aware, in the particular texture of the war around them, that the campaign is not going as the command briefings suggest. They know by the replacement rates in their own squads. By the way, the commissar's speeches have shifted register from inspirational to exhortatory to the particular cadence of threats made by someone who has run out of other tools. They know, and into this knowing, someone hands them a grain loaf, dense, slightly sweet, smelling of nothing in particular by this point in its journey, all the particulate history of the plate processed and compressed and distance emptied from it. They eat it the way people eat when eating is a maintenance function, and nothing more. They finish it. They pick up their weapon. They continue. They never know about Edric Voss. They never know about Catha and her 40 seconds and her horizon. They never know about Ondine Prass margin notation. The grain loaf is anonymous. That is the point. The Monitorum's agricultural assessment data, the DAI. That exists in official records, in sealed cogitator vaults aboard Compliance, Hub, Tertius, above the planet, in the actuarial projections that the Governor Praetor's administrative staff log and do not distribute. This data shows that Veridian Secundus will, in approximately 300 years, reach a point where the chemical augmentation can no longer compensate for the degraded organic foundation of the soil. The yield will begin to decline, slowly at first, then accelerating the way all collapses accelerate once the structural tolerance is exceeded. The quota will not decline with it. The war does not negotiate with soil chemistry. The gap between what the world can produce and what the war demands will widen in the patient, geological way of things that cannot stop themselves, and the world will be reclassified. progressive yield diminishment leading to tithe reclassification. Tiled, stamped, redistributed to the remaining cultivation nodes in the subsector, which will be asked to increase their yield. The math will not change. There is no exterminatus planned for Veridian Secundus, no invasion, no warp breach or Xenos incursion to give it a dramatic ending worth recording. It will simply be a world that used to be in the tithe record and is no longer. The harvest machines will begin to cross zones where the topsoil depth is insufficient to support even the engineered grain strains. The zero-yield zones will expand. The workers, their population already thinning as surplus diminishes before yield diminishes because the rations are calculated against surplus first, will thin alongside the fields in the same quiet, undramatic way. And Edric Voss's successor will still maintain the ledger, will still run the thumb along the edge of each data slate, will still write the numbers down, until the convoys stop coming, and then there will be no new data slates, and the ledger will simply stop, not with a final entry, not with a closing statement. It will stop mid-cycle, the way all things on Veridian Secundus stop, not in fire, but in diminishment, in the slow narrowing of what is possible until possibility runs out. The Imperium of Man is too large to be wrong at a local scale. And notice, there are thousands of worlds like Veridian Secundus. There may be tens of thousands, worlds whose entire identity has been engineered into a single function, worlds whose people have been calibrated across generations toward one contributory purpose and who are now in the same slow process of diminishment, the same inexorable widening of the gap between what they can give and what the war demands. The Munitorum knows the number. It manages these worlds the way a river manages eroding banks, not by correcting the relationship, but by accommodating the shift, adjusting the channel. There are always other banks. The Imperium is large enough that there are always others. This is the only reason the arithmetic continues to function. Not because the relationship between consumption and production has been corrected, but because the Imperium is large enough to bleed out slowly across 10,000 worlds simultaneously and still have enough left to keep bleeding. The soldiers who ate the grain loaf, the ones whose unit designations appear in the casualty aggregates that Edric Voss transcribes, whose individual names will never appear in any document associated with Veridian Secundus, they noticed, in the only way available to them, they were alive, and then they were not, and in the interval of their living, they were cold and exhausted and afraid, and someone handed them a grain loaf that tasted of nothing in particular, and they ate it, and they were grateful in the reflex way of people who have learned not to expect anything more than the reflex, and then they continued until they could not. This is the transaction at the center of everything. This is what Undine Prost understood when she wrote in the margin of the data slate. The Lectio Divinitatis has an answer for it. The Munitorum has an answer. The folk theology of the plate has an answer. None of the answers agree, except on one point. It continues, not victory, not peace, not the dream of something better waiting at the end of the grinding. Just continuation. The momentum of a civilization at war so long that the war is no longer the exception, but the medium in which everything else occurs. Somewhere beneath a workstation in Hobspire 19, in a sealed case, a man has been counting the dead for 30 years. He will count them tomorrow. The soil is adequate. The quota will increase. And somewhere in the fields at night, under the hard white light of the harvest luminators, a 12-year-old girl is learning not to look at the horizon. She will look anyway.